Hey everybody, welcome to Apocalypse Rising. Thanks for tuning in. Hope everybody had a good weekend. I'll go ahead and make a video here during my lunch break. It seems like I'm only putting out about one video a week. I was trying to put out more, but I realized once I started getting into some of these articles, it was difficult to keep them short enough. I was shooting for maybe 10 to 12 minutes per video, but they started getting into the 18, 20 minutes. So maybe I'll only do one a week, or I could try to shorten them down. I don't know. You all let me know down in the comment section what kind of format you'd rather see for this channel. And on that note, let's go ahead and jump onto the website. I made some changes here just quickly. I'll go over, I added 3 new sections here because I just found it difficult to, especially with science, to get, enough stuff just in that one area. So I decided to expand it to include technology. And then I got an oddities because I kept finding all these weird articles. I didn't really know where to put them at all. Things like genetically engineered pigs and scientists that have created edible steak made from human cells, and how honeybees use animal dung to fend off giant murder hornets, and that, there's aliens and those kinds of things. I thought I'd put them in this section just for fun. And then I thought I'd add a hope section because I know I'm just so negative all the time about the outlook here that I have on the climate, especially, and how it pertains to our survival as a species. And so I put some things in here to kind of liven it up a bit. And what I also did was I started working on the archive. So I think today I'm going to pick an article from the archives. I tried to highlight the ones that I thought were the most pertinent, and mainly just off of the titles. So I think I'm going to go ahead and cover this one today. Net zero climate targets, read the fine print. I really like things like read the fine print because that's something that I think we all lack our due diligence on the fine print a lot of times. So this is from phys.org. I guess I really like this outfit. I tend to get a lot of articles from here. This one's titled Net Zero Climate Targets, Read the Fine Print. And I guess I just like to start this off by saying, kind of my position here on this. I do believe we have the technologies and we have the science and everything that we need to solve climate change. What I think is that we didn't start doing it early enough. Like, we need to start doing this stuff in the early 2000s. And at the turn of the century, we need to have the mentality that this is going to be an issue for us during our lifetime, instead of these really outlandish, in my opinion, dates. 2050, 2100, we don't have until 2050 or 2100 at this rate. And just by reducing our carbon output, it's not going to get us anywhere near where we need to be to save ourselves from extinction.
Ain't nobody got time for that
at this point. So let's see what this article has to say. It says the worldwide effort to prevent Earth from becoming an unlivable hothouse is in the grips of net zero fever, which is fine. We definitely do need to reduce our emissions, but it's this idea that going net zero is going to be what saves us. This is just part of the solution. More than 110 countries have committed to becoming carbon neutral by mid-century. So once again, we're talking about 2050, and only 110 countries. I mean, how many countries are there in the world? These include Britain, Japan, and South Korea. So the European Union has taken the vow, as has incoming US President Joe Biden, to basically get us back onto the Paris Accord and try to reach those goals set out, I think it was in about 2015, to be reducing our emissions by a certain percent every year to reach the target of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, 2100. It's still not clear to me exactly what the goal is there, but basically it's to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we can argue that it's close to that now. It might even be over it. China, which generates a quarter of all carbon pollution, set 2060 as the year when any remaining emissions from energy, agriculture, or industry must be offset by tree farms or experimental technologies that suck CO2 from the air. So even China has had to kind of push their goals out to 2060 because they're not going to make it by 2050. And they're talking about tree farms, which in my opinion are a joke. This is not going to do anything. And also experimental technologies that suck CO2 from the air. This is more like it. This really should have already been put into place. We should already be taking CO2 from the air. More than 65% of global CO2 emissions now fall under such pledges, according to a UN estimate. So here we're even only talking about 62% of emissions. That means 35% is still going to be putting out greenhouse gases at the rate that it is now, or maybe even further.
You stupid.
And you want to pretend like we're going to keep it below 1.5 degrees in any point? Let's see what else this has to say. The London-based Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit calculates the aggregate GDP of nations, cities, and states with 2050 net zero targets is 46 trillion, well over half of global GDP. So it's going to cost a lot of money, and who knows if economies can continue expanding as they are at the moment, well, at least before the coronavirus came in and wreaked havoc. This may cause massive unemployment and company failures and all kinds of societal upheaval to try to reach these climate goals by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I firmly believe that 2021 can be a new kind of leap year, the year of a quantum leap towards carbon neutrality.
Have you ever had a dream you could do anything?
I don't know why you're saying that. Every country, city, financial institution, and company should adopt plans for transitioning to net zeros by 2050. Well, that sounds like a utopia, guy. Every financial institution and company should adopt plans, but are they? Well, let's find out, because the devil is in the detail. But what is being promised? And will it deliver the Paris Agreement goals of capping global warming at well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, or better yet, under the treaty's aspirational 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling? So here's why it's confusing. It's talking about being well below 2 degrees, but right around 1.5. You're really scared of that 2 degrees. That's my opinion. We all should be, because when we get to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, you're going to see CO2 coming out of everywhere. Soil, peat, permafrost, ice, forest, I mean, you name it, and it's going to be releasing into the atmosphere. It's already doing that with methane from the ice and the permafrost that's melting. In many cases, net zero pledges are an improvement, but in others, the net provision is a black box that can conceal all sorts of problems. Earth's surface has already warmed 1.2 Cs. I mean, here we go. It's already 1.2 and it's only 2020. And you're trying to think that you can keep it below 1.5 by 2030, 2100, making extreme weather more deadly. And new research shows that a return to 2019 levels of carbon pollution would likely push the world past the 1.5 C milestone around 2030. Okay, so this is the date I'm more concerned with here. 2050, 2100. I mean, if we don't start sucking carbon out of the air effectively now, 2030 is just going to be when we finally realize there's no stopping it. The devil is in the details. There are several keys to evaluating the worth of carbon neutral promises. The first is whether they apply to all greenhouse gases or just carbon dioxide. Well, because we know that methane, it might not last in the atmosphere for as long, but it has more of a warming effect for the shorter period of time that it's here. That's why in the short term, we're going to see even further increases of methane. And then if it just continues to pump out from the positive feedback loops that nature is in right at the moment, then you can keep pushing that date out further and further that we're still putting methane into the atmosphere, even if as humans we stop. putting it out with natural gas and those types of things. CO2 is responsible for more than 3/4 of global warming, but concentrations of methane, mostly from natural gas leaks and animal husbandry, are rising and could capsize the Paris Treaty goals if not brought to heel. I mean, and this is just a small portion of what's going on. Even if we did stop animal production of methane and natural gas leaks, there's so much in the atmosphere now, it would continue to heat. I don't understand why this isn't like the main conversation point, how dire, how imperative it is to remove what's in the atmosphere now rapidly. New Zealand, for instance, cemented its net zero by 2050 vows into law in November 2019, but with a woolly caveat. It only applies to CO2. A third of the country's total emissions come from belching cattle and especially sheep. So this is why I like lab-produced meat. If we could go ahead and just create these labs and have them run off of green energy and build them with non-concrete materials, then we could make a huge dent in the methane that's being released from cattle. And then with sheep, I'm assuming you're using a lot of the sheep for material for their wool. My personal opinion is we should be using hemp.
Smoke weed every day.
Hemp, it can be used for clothing. It can be used for building material. The list goes on, and it's a carbon sink at the same time. Kicking the can. A second red flag is a lack of intermediate hard targets before 2050. A smoker who promises to quit while carrying on with a pack a day for the next 30 years will still do themselves a lot of damage. That's where we're at. It's still going to take a lot of carbon emissions to get us to carbon neutrality. So we're still going to be emitting while we're moving towards a net zero emissions global society. Scientists are categorical about the need for deep near-term reductions in carbon pollution. The UN's Climate Science Advisory Panel said emissions must drop 45% by 2030 and then 100% by 2050 to have any hope of staying on this side of the 1.5 degree Celsius guardrail. So we're talking about 2050 and 1.5, yet here we are at 1.2. And we're just barely starting to see the effects of positive feedback loops from melting ice and methane. And so the methane is even more of a warming component, and we're only going to be 100% carbon emissions free by 2050. What about everything that's in the atmosphere right now as we speak? Last week, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave the UN climate change a boot. I don't even want to read about this stuff because this means nothing.
Damn, Daniel.
Unless you start removing carbon from the atmosphere now, it doesn't matter how much you reduce man-made carbon emissions. The European Union could boost its 2030 pledge later this week to 55%. Who cares?
He needs some milk.
China, the world's top consumer of coal, has hinted it might pledge to peak emissions in 2025, 5 years earlier than its long-standing pledge. But we're talking about peaking. So everything that's already been done up to 2025 is still lingering in the atmosphere. Am I missing something here?
21.
But despite the pandemic, its 2020 emissions will exceed those in 2019. So even with the pandemic, China still put out more emissions than they did in 2019. 1 trillion trees. A third crucial measure is how much of a net zero commitment will be fulfilled with short-term emission cuts and how much will come from so-called negative emissions technology. Here we go. Okay, I was getting worried there for a minute that people aren't thinking about this. You cannot get to net zero without some carbon dioxide removal. Okay, this is from a German researcher, not some guy in his office. And clearly, this is something that needs to happen. And yet, all of the options on the table for taking excess carbon out of the air remain deeply flawed.
Breakfast.
To work at scale, an area more than twice the size of India would be needed for tree farms by the latter half of the century. Why are we talking about tree farms? Those are not going to be the answer. Last year, a scheme unveiled by Swiss scientists to solve the climate crisis by planting 1 trillion trees, quickly embraced by fossil fuel companies and even US President Donald Trump, was picked apart by experts as based on faulty calculations and requiring unrealistic amounts of land and water and effort and time. And the fact that if the planet continues heating, which it will, drought will continue to spread and those forests will likely burn and release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere if the soil can even hold on to it. Another approach in which the CO2 emitted from burning biofuels is buried underground runs into a similar problem. I had a little more hope for carbon capture. Now, after reading this article, we may have to throw it in the dumpster with geoengineering here.
Mega doo-doo.
Meanwhile, technology that draws CO2 directly from the air to be sequestered or converted into fuel pellets remains in its infancy. So even the things that might possibly work, we already need to be doing this, and those technologies aren't even ready to go at the moment. They won't be ready to go until 2030, which at that point we're going to be looking around going, oh man, we made a big mistake here. There is a large degree of uncertainty about the scale and availability of future carbon removals from both land-based carbon sinks and emerging carbon removal technologies, not to mention how much carbon emissions is it going to take to create all this stuff and to make it work. The handful of fossil fuel companies which claim their futures are compatible with Paris Agreement targets, such as Shell and BP, rely very heavily on both to justify near-term plans to ramp up exploration and production of oil and gas. Yeah, they love this stuff because they feel like they can continue on doing what they're doing if they just plant some trees. That ain't going to cut it. A UN report last week showed that global fossil fuel production must in fact decline roughly 6% annually over the next decade to keep the 1.5C target in view. Over the next decade, 2030. I want you to keep that in your mind, folks. 2030. Loopholes. Finally, one must read the fine print of net zero pledges to see exactly what is or is not included. So here we're probably talking about policy. There is no agreed set of principles and guidelines, and so it's rife with loopholes. And many national schemes leave out the aviation and shipping sectors, which, come on, that pollutes so much. Leaving that out solves absolutely nothing. Most, if not all, of the aviation and oil sector plans are seriously flawed, with a heavy reliance on biological sinks, trees, which we're throwing that directly in the dumpster, to offset ongoing fossil fuel emissions. So they're not going to do anything. Good plans are the ones that maximize reduction at the source and redesign their technologies accordingly. We need to phase how we do things to a green economy. We can't think that offsetting is going to be the answer. We actually have to transition. We're going to have to offset as well, but to think that offset only is the solution is extremely flawed. Experts say net zero plans should clearly separate targets for slashing greenhouse gas emissions from future carbon removal schemes. So these removal schemes are paramount. And if we can't get that off the ground, we're doomed. If you have explicit targets on both sides, it becomes harder, both politically and reputationally, to fudge one against the other and to conceal dodgy choices. So basically what we have to do is we have to get big oil and these large corporations out of the pockets of politicians before any of this can be successful. And unfortunately, that is in line with the idea that we can change society to not eat meat. And that's going to save us from, putting out massive amounts of carbon emissions from the agriculture side of things. It's about the same to say, oh, well, we've got to get these big companies out of politics.
Do it! Just do it!
That's not going to happen very soon either. But even if promises on carbon neutrality are all kept, only stabilizes the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Yeah, so that means everything that we're seeing now, all the temperatures, all the weather patterns, it's going to continue and most likely get worse as the positive feedback loops continue to emit gases into the atmosphere. That means climate change impacts will remain as bad or worse. Okay, so what I just said, that we have to bring the concentrations down that are already in the atmosphere while we reduce what we put in the atmosphere to zero. Okay, so this article was interesting. It was different than I thought it was going to be, and it really kind of put a dampening on carbon capture because I really thought that was going to be an option. At least we gave it a foul ball.
These nuts.
But boy, it's not looking so good now. Well, that's all I have to say about that article. I know that it sounds doom and gloom, so if you're interested, go to the website and check out the hope section and maybe perk up your mood. I think I've given my daily dose of doom today, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the week. I may or may not put out another video. I think the best thing you can do is just, if you're a subscriber, click the bell. If you're not, go ahead and subscribe and click the bell. I would like to give a shout out to all the new subscribers. I got another kind of rush of subscribers from my last video about lab grown meat. So if you haven't watched that, go check it out. I'll leave a little tag up in the corner like I always do, and I'll leave this article in the description. And other than that, we'll talk to you next time.